Boa tarde, todos e todas e todes. Para quem esteve conosco ao longo da semana, é ótimo tê-los de volta, muito obrigado. Para quem está aqui pela primeira vez, bem-vindo. Espero que gostem dos debates que teremos hoje. Damos hoje, então, prosseguimento às atividades do evento Imaginações, Políticas para o Século XXI, John Rawls, Democracia e Justiça Social. Queria mencionar aqui mais uma vez que o evento foi organizado pelo Grupo Direitos Humanos, Democracia e Memória, do IEA-USP, em parceria com o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política da Unicamp, e que recebeu apoio também do SEDEC e do DEJUS, o Grupo DEJUS do SEBRAP. Então, muito obrigado mais uma vez a todas as instituições envolvidas. Foi uma excelente oportunidade de fazer um diálogo interinstitucional, além de interdisciplinar. A nossa conferência de encerramento hoje será em inglês, mas como de costume, aceitamos perguntas pelo chat do IEA no canal do YouTube. As perguntas podem ser feitas em português e tentaremos vertê-las para o inglês na medida do possível. Só peço um pouco de paciência com os tradutores, se esse for o caso. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucas Petroni, and today is our last panel in the Moral Imaginations for the 21st Century, John Rawls, Democracy and Social Justice. Thank you so much for staying with us along this busy week of seminars and conferences. Our conference today is entitled Socialism Alone, Rawls in the Future of Progressive Politics, and we are honored to have with us Professor Edmundson, whom I will introduce properly in due course. During this week, our seminars have addressed a broad array of topics, such as ideal versus non-ideal theory, the role of imagination in politics, fighting back intolerance with education, the relation between justice-driven versus injustice-driven theorization in political theory, alternatives to capitalism, local experiments with basic income politics, just to mention a few of them. Today, our focus will be on the connections between a democratic society, the value of political equality, socialism maybe, in what a truly egalitarian reading of John Rawls has to do with all that. William Edmundson is Regents Professor of Law and Philosophy at Georgia State University. He's the author of plenty of books and dozens of articles on the nature of rights and political authority, legal theory, legal history in the United States, theories of justice, the normativity of consent, promise, and disobedience, the value of political liberties, and the relevance of classic socialist subjects, such as the means of production in contemporary egalitarian politics. Among such an impressive range of topics and publications, I would like to highlight here with you his 2004 book, An Introduction to Rights, reissued in 2012 by Cambridge University Press, of which we actually have a Brazilian translation of. And it's titled Uma Introdução aos Direitos, de 2006, que eu recomendo fortemente. Secondly, I would like to bring to the fore Edmundson's 2017 masterpiece, John Rawls' Reticent Socialist, published by Cambridge University Press, a work which, to put it lightly, reshaped almost single-handed the literature on the institutional consequences and the political economy underpinning Rawls' theory of justice. In his superbly guided reading of Rawls, Edmundson led us through the maze of justice as fairness, sometimes traveling back and forth among different works in different times, putting some compelling evidence for the claim that at the very core of the Rawlsian project, one can found a serious commitment to democratic socialism, properly understood, as the only mode of production that could realize the two principles of justice as they were laid down by Rawls himself on a theory of justice and justice as fairness and restatement. With his counterintuitive, but at the same time very well-worked reading of Rawls's philosophy, Edmundson is today one of the most important, I would say, left Rawlsians on activity in political philosophy. In the very brief period of time, actually, since its publication, this book has invigorated socialists, left liberals, and progressives in their struggles to reframe, if not the economic basis of our democracies themselves, at least the potential, the political imagination for our tomorrow's tasks. Let me share with you just one piece from the 2017 book that I consider particularly enlightening regarding with Edmundson's philosophical goals. I quote, Rawls's theory furnishes a common language in which people who are concerned enough about justice to want to understand it can communicate. It's a theoretic lingua franca having few precedents, one being the dominance of the Marxian framework in Europe countries on the eve of the First World War, end of quotation. This Rawlsian momentum in progressive forces taking on different aspects, conceptual, normative aspects of the Rawls's philosophy can, according to Edmundson, I quote again, create a world historic opportunity for real progress, end of quotation. In his brand new book, Socialism for Soloists, published by Polity Press 2021, here I have it, Edmundson changes gear in order to provide a freestanding case for socialism and socialist politics in general, particularly tailored for the most difficult, but maybe most urgent audience in progressive politics, namely the figure of the soloist, someone who believes that every single person has an equal say in political decisions and would never trade his or her individual rights off. Soloists here cannot be confused neither with egotists, ruthless self-seekers, nor with solipsists, loners who disregard the well-being and projects of others. To keep the jazz metaphor going, we should say that from an egalitarian point of view, the stance of soloing, having a life to lead on one's own terms, should not be confused with playing the hat in society's collective music, a necessary, common, and enriching activity in which all of us are embedded. Our today's commentator is Sebastian Rudas, who is a political theorist and currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of São Paulo, with a particular eye for the liberalism's normative infrastructure and issues of moral neutrality in contexts of hegemonic religions and cultural practices. Please, Professor Edmundson, join us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to contribute. Sebastian, thank you too for agreeing to respond to what I'm going to present here today. And thank all of you for looking in. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but before I do, let me say that the title of this proceeding is striking because it refers to Rawls and imagination in the same sentence. There are quite a few people who think of Rawls as being the death of the moral imagination. Think of Rawls as having attempted to strangle our imaginations by forcing it into a rigid theoretical framework that seemed to make conceive human beings in a rather abstract and somewhat cold way. I think that's a misimpression. But it is true that that a number of people have, in good faith, wanted to sort of go beyond Rawls, who was, of course, notoriously guided by a distinction he made between ideal and non-ideal theory. Of course, he was aware that we're never going to see anything other than a non-ideal world. And he chose to work almost exclusively in ideal theory. The longing many of us increasingly feel to be shown how to manage our lives in our current circumstances, which have, in the 50 years since the appearance of a theory of justice, have changed so dramatically and are continuing to change almost on a 24-hourly basis. So with that, in ideal theory, Rawls proposes that we conceive of society in a certain way. And we conceive it as a cooperative undertaking intended for mutual advantage. And if you buy this, if you adopt this perspective, then the world takes a certain shape, I think. And Rawls argued that if we adopt a certain point of view, conceiving society in this way, we would be able to derive principles of justice. This, of course, is his original position idea, which he viewed as simply a continuation of the social contract tradition going back at least to Hobbes. If we put a veil of ignorance between ourselves and the world, we would choose principles that could not be calibrated to advance our own interests, to entrench our own position, or even to advance our own most deeply held beliefs about what's worthwhile. And from this perspective, he set us a certain choice problem. What principles should we achieve if we were only interested in securing for ourselves primary goods, which he described as all-purpose means of advancing our personal conception of the good, or our comprehensive conception of the good, whatever it might be. And so let's adopt that perspective. Now I'm going to share my screen. I hope if I'm successful. That lead in and play. Is this coming through? Okay, can you see this? Okay. Anyway, the title I finally landed on was Political Equality, Epistocracy, and Expensive Tastes. And if these terms don't immediately come into focus, I'll try to make them clearer. If we conceive of society as a fair cooperative venture or enterprise intended for mutual benefit, and we ask how should we divide the primary goods, whatever they happen to be and whatever amount they might might turn out to be, once we lift the veil of ignorance, what principle would we use? What would we choose for the division of the goods of the world? A natural starting point would be a division of equality. That's an intuitively appealing starting point. Now, from which departures need to be justified. So we can depict this by drawing a 45-degree line and imagining that there are, let's slow down first. We might decide that there are some primary goods that are not properly regarded as to be divided as though they were. Anyway, the title I finally landed on was Political Equality, Epistocracy, and Expensive Tastes. And if these terms don't immediately come into focus, I'll try to make them clearer. If we conceive of society as a fair cooperative venture or enterprise intended for mutual benefit, and we ask how should we divide the primary goods, whatever they happen to be and whatever amount they might turn out to be. Once we lift the veil of ignorance, what principle would we use? What would we choose for the division of the goods of the world? A natural starting point would be a division of equality. That's an intuitively appealing starting point. Now, from which departures need to be justified. So we can depict this by drawing a 45-degree line and imagining that there are, let's slow down first. We might decide that there are some primary goods that are not properly regarded as to be divided as though they were a common property. But certainly income and wealth can be thought of this way. So let's focus on income and wealth as a primary good and ask whether the appealing principle we arrive at can be extended to all of the primary goods. Income and wealth, fungible, determinable, and we can think of society as divided into a less advantaged and a more advantaged group of people, or classes, if you like. Clearly, this is an idealization because there will probably be many other more differentiations to be made than this. But if we have the less advantage, we can represent the amount of income and wealth they enjoy on the y-axis, and that enjoyed by the more advantaged on the x-axis. What would justify a departure from divisions along the 45-degree angle? Departures from equality. Well, if we think of how the productive enterprise we call society would go, we can think of an OP curve representing the output, total output of income and wealth, total product, as reaching its maximum somewhere off of the 45-degree line. In other words, an unequal division might be to the advantage of everyone up to a certain point. At a certain point, radically unequal divisions will lead to a lesser social product. We might find ourselves returning to a feudal condition But as long as we are on the upward sloping portion of this OP curve, the less advantaged have no claim of justice to have an equal share, because they're better off than they would be were they to have an equal share. The moves up to this point are, we can say, Pareto efficient, to insist that we stay on the 45-degree line of equal division between the less and more advantaged would mean much lower social productivity. The pie would be smaller. The D point is where the absolute share of the less advantaged reaches its maximum. It's short of what we can call the B point, which is the point at which the social product reaches its maximum. At this point, the less advantaged members of society can complain that they would be better off under a more equal distribution. And Rawls's argument is that justice requires that wealth and income be divided in such a way that it is to the greatest absolute advantage of the less advantaged members of society. This is the celebrated difference principle. Okay. Now, should we apply the difference principle to all primary goods? As primary goods include such things, not just as income and wealth, but also the social bases of self-respect, political rights, freedom of conscience, and so forth. And those, he believed, would not be subject to the kind of balancing reasoning or trade-offs that would be allowed under, say, Benthamite or utilitarian reasoning. It might be that we would all be wealthier if we lived in a strictly Calvinist society, but it would not be a demand of justice that anyone can make that Calvinism be installed as the state religion. The focus here I want to make on this is the difference principle. Now I want to look at a particular kind of primary good. Call it political influence. It's unlike income and wealth. We can't treat it the way we treat income and wealth. There are certain basic equal political rights that choosers in the original position would insist upon. Freedom of speech, freedom to run for office, freedom to hold office, and of course, the right to vote. But allowing inequality of wealth has consequences. And one of the major consequence of concern here is that those with more wealth may get greater value out of their equal basic liberties. An example that Rawls uses is freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience is more valuable to those practitioners of a religion that requires expensive pilgrimages, because they have a greater opportunity to take those pilgrimages. Nonetheless, Rawls insists that freedom of conscience, if it's of lesser worth to us because of how much income and wealth we have, that's on us. That's a matter of personal responsibility. In a sense, wanting to be a Muslim is, and to take the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca during one's lifetime means, you've got to earn in the market, the labor market, what it takes to take that pilgrimage. Your freedom of conscience has a lesser value to you than it does to someone else who's able to afford those pilgrimages. That falls under a principle of personal responsibility, or I'll just call it a principle of responsibility. So we have the equal basic liberties in the first principle, and we have the difference principle and the fair equality of opportunity principle in the second principle. Political influence, how should it be treated? Rawls's view, which is what sets him apart much more than is appreciated from other so-called liberals of the 20th century, is that we can't treat political influence as we do income and wealth. That is because it doesn't behave the way other goods in life do. Things like bread and beer. As he wrote, the democratic political process is at best a regulated rivalry. It does not even in theory have the desirable properties that price theory ascribes to truly competitive markets. Now, it could have said more here about what those desirable properties are and what a truly competitive market, but just assuming that a familiarity with what I refer to sometimes flippantly as Econ 101, it's simply that in a truly competitive market, if there's more demand for something, there will eventually be a greater and more affordable supply of it. And that's why paupers and kings alike can chow down on McDonald's Big Macs and sort of enjoy a kind of equality unimaginable in previous centuries, I suppose. Political influence isn't like that. In politics, you have winners and losers. And the winners, you can't divide political influence according to a difference principle and have a happy result. Doesn't make sense because there's no output curve, OP curve that's applicable here. What you have is something like this. You can increase the total amount of political influence that's being exerted. That can vary. But dividing it unequally doesn't ever going to increase the share of the less advantaged. More for us means less for them, and vice versa. So the choosers in the original position, Rawls argues, would insist upon a principle of fair valued political equality, rather than merely formal political equality. And this fair value guarantee attaches only to the equal basic political liberties, what we can think of as the formal political liberties. Even freedom of conscience, its value as enjoyed by an individual is subject to a principle of responsibility. That's not the case with respect to political influence, measured at equivalent levels of what I will call political competence. Those, in other words, those who have are equally able in political disputation, argument, and equally motivated to engage in it, must have equal political influence. This entails that the influence of money and other traits irrelevant to political competence ought not to have, or their influence on political decision-making should be minimized. Focusing on money, what realizing the principles, the two principles of justice and fairness, as fairness requires, is that not only the formal but fair equality in politics must be guaranteed. If it's not, the society is to that extent less just. Now, in his later work, Rawls expanded on this matter of institutional choice, and he made it clear that all forms of capitalism are disqualify themselves as just societies, insofar as justice as fairness is concerned, because they disavow any interest in achieving, much less guaranteeing, political equality in this sense, in the Rawlsian sense of not merely formal, but fair value political equality. Well, I mean, who could possibly disagree with this? It all sounds so compelling. Isn't this what all liberals believe? No. Ronald Dworkin, in elaborating his theory of equality, warned that a genuine democracy cannot treat political impact or influence as themselves resources to be divided according to some metric of equality, the way land or raw materials or investments might be divided. Now, this is something that may be entirely friendly to Rawls. Rawls himself says you can't treat political influence the same way you treat other primary goods like income and wealth. But Dworkin goes in a quite different direction than Rawls without fully providing an argument why. Let's not treat political influence under the same principle of division we would apply to income and wealth. Let's just treat it as a matter of responsibility, not another dimension of wealth. That's what politics is. If you have less political influence, that's tough luck. That's like, converting to Islam and finding out that you can't afford a pilgrimage to Mecca, or in the 16th century, converting to Catholicism and finding out that you can't pay the indulgences. That's an expensive taste. It's like developing a taste for pre-phylloxera clarets, which is, I think, an example made famous by John Maynard Keynes. It's society's responsibility to provide, for example, basic education, but it's not society's responsibility to provide you with expensive wines, tickets to travel to religious sites. And it's not society's responsibility to get you into a political office or to give you a political say, even. We can't treat it that way. Rawls agrees and says, well, we must have a principle of fair valued political equality, such that citizens possessing equal aptitude and equal motivation for politics should have an equal shot, an equal influence, regardless of their social connections and wealth, essentially. Money out of politics, in short. Dworkin rejects that idea. But he, I think, came to regret the developments in the United States that were also great anguish, I guess, to all liberals of whatever description. I didn't want to go to Esalen just yet. I've got all these slides that I'm not showing you. It would just take forever to get through them. I want to give a fair picture of Dworkin's view. Dworkin, this is what he wrote in I think 1987, and by 1996, he wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books called "The Curse of Politics" or "The Curse of American Politics" or something like that, in which he deplored the influence of money on politics. Well, I mean, what is your principal objection to this? Is it just ugly looking? Or is there a principal objection? I mean, Rawls has a quite clear objection to it based on the principle of fair valued political equality. Dworkin has tells us that we can't treat political influence as subject to some metric of equality, like fair valued equality. No, it's a matter of responsibility. Well, Rawls says, no, you can't treat it like wealth or income. And you can't treat it as something you're just responsible for either. In a just society, every citizen must have a fair valued and equal political say. Dworkin's suggestion was something in 1996 was, I'm forgetting exactly, it's in the paper, how he phrased it, but there had to be everybody had to you had to magnify the voices of everybody, and you had to sort of give everybody a forum, I mean, which was, made, I guess, some sense in 1996. By 2016, you begin to wonder, like, are we really, giving everybody, free access to a Twitter account just hasn't, worked out as well as we might have hoped in 1996. This takes me to the view of David Estlin. When I think I'm mistakenly identified as a student of Rawls's. I don't think he was a PhD student of Rawls's, but he did, I think, sit in on some courses of Rawls's. A very astute political philosopher at Brown. And Estlin has a different criticism of Rawls that emphasizes the importance of fashioning democracies so that they have an epistemic value. Put it differently, we could get fair valued political equality on the cheap in ways that we would just reject as wrong-headed. For example, by lottery. We can make decisions by lottery and everyone would have a fairly equal, as well as formally equal chance of picking the winning number, or if you like. And no one would be able to influence the picking of a random number out of a basket by spending money on television ads and so forth. It would also filter out all kinds of traits that are irrelevant to political competence. One of them might be height. Taller people tend to be more influential, wholly apart from anything that might come out of their mouths. There's a certain something called charisma, which we want to filter out. We can't filter that out. What we don't want to filter out are, epistemic virtues. And one might say that these are personal, and we want to have an epistocracy composed of the smart people. And who knows, maybe some smart person has maintained that for longer than the time it takes to think about it. I don't know of any. Mill, though, entertain the idea. You got to give everybody a vote, because they'll be angry if you don't get, if they don't get a vote. And let's give sort of the university educated extra votes. Mill himself not being either university educated nor known for his irony. It's hard to know how serious he was about this, but he was essentially, as Rawls put it, Mill's idea is sort of like the difference principle in its general form. Okay, the thought is that if you could get more accurate democratic decisions by allowing unequal influence, then you should go that way, maybe, or that's a reason to give up on Rawlsian political equality, that is the fair value idea. And he puts it something like, he calls it political quality. We want the most just decisions to be made by democracy, and we can design democracy in a way that makes for better decisions epistemically if we don't insist on inequality of political influence of the kind that Rawls talks about. Inequality of opportunity for political input may be called for on epistemic grounds, so long as it provides more input opportunity for everyone and it is not too unequal. The idea is that we have something like an OP curve. I mean, Estlin, I think, acknowledges that sometimes maybe more inputs is not going to lead to more accurate decisions, but surely it makes sense to think of there being something like the D point and the difference principle. Let's allow, as long as conditions are such that everybody is able to make, a loud noise, that might be better, or make a point up to a certain point of where the inequality becomes unacceptable. So I interpret Estlin as suggesting that, contrary really to both Rawls and Dworkin, is we treat political influence as we do any other good. And we allow, well, he sort of modulates between political input and political influence in a way that can be make it sometimes hard to make sure when it's receiving the message that David is sending. But certainly has a point about not wanting to cut off discussion when further discussion would be fruitful. I think we can all agree that more is better, other things being equal. So I gather that making the adjustment that Estlin proposes would rule out the use of spending caps as a way of trying to achieve political equality. But back to Rawls, Rawls suggested two types of mechanisms for institutionalizing political equality. One type were I'd call insulation devices, which means keeping money out of politics, keeping its influence or moderating its influence, either by subsidizing the less wealthy or by capping the expenditures or contributions allowed to be made by the more wealthy. And contrast to that, anti-accumulation devices, which strike at the accumulation of unequal or grossly unequal wealth. And so far as we apply Estlin's critique to Rawls's description of what he called a property-owning democracy, I think what we can derive fairly from Estlin's a caution against imposing expenditure caps, and maybe also against contribution caps. But that sort of shifts the weight of performing the difficult task of achieving political equality onto the anti-accumulation side. John Rawls, born 100 years ago this year. I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Professor, for the enlightening talk. You were totally punctual. Thank you for that. I believe you have plenty of time for debates, discussions, but I will just call Sebastian Hudas for comments, and then we can go back to you as a response for Ruda's reactions, and then we can start collecting some questions and comments from YouTube or our guests. So please, Sebastian.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, Professor, for this very interesting presentation. I have to say I feel very fortunate because 2-3 months ago, we, in a reading group to which Lucas belongs as well, and some of the organizers of the conference belong to that group, we were actually reading your book on Rawls and socialism. So as it happens in reading groups, we were disagreeing with each other, disagreeing with the book, agreeing with the book, thinking further, you know, like all these kind of debates. And I feel that some of the comments that I'm going to make today somehow originate in those discussions that we were having a couple of months ago. And I feel kind of, this is not very often that it happens that you read the book and then you have the author, you know, of a book in front of you discussing, well, in front of you, kind of, so to speak. So I'm going to make, I think 4 or 5 comments or questions, probably critical questions on your presentation. They are, I think, quite punctual. They go to different, I think they go, each of them goes to each of the parts of the presentation, actually. And I would like to start with a general question about political inequality or political equality. So the way I understood you is that you're presenting political, the concern about political inequality as deriving from economic inequalities. So the idea being, if we allow to grade economic inequalities, then those inequalities can easily translate into political power, and well, the wealthy will rule the country, which is actually what happens. And I think is actually what has happened, I guess, always in democracies, right? Like there is always an economic elite that rules. So that's probably, and that's, I think, Rawls's argument as well, right? Like inequalities should be restricted, partly because we need to protect democracy. And I was wondering, so I absolutely agree with that. I don't have any kind of criticism to that kind. That seems quite convincing, right? But I was wondering about other forms of political inequality that might not necessarily derive from economic inequalities. I'm thinking of racial inequalities, gender inequalities, which also can be seen, also can be conceptualized as forms of political inequalities, right? So we are ruled by oligarchs, but they tend to be male, right? So it's not like wealthy women can translate their economic power into political power in the same way as wealthy men can do. So it seems that there is this form of inequality in politics that doesn't necessarily originate or is not, so it might be independent of economic inequality. So I'm not saying it is absolutely independent, but there is a way we can think like, even if we control for economic inequalities, maybe we end up with, you know, like white guys ruling and excluding other people, even if economic equality is in place. So I was just wondering whether the mechanisms that you were mentioning at the end of your talk, these insulation mechanisms, like getting money out of politics, or anti-accumulation mechanisms, I would like to know your thoughts about how able those mechanisms can be to reach political equality in those dimensions as well. So that would be kind of my first question. Then and then I won't go like in the same order. I don't know why, but in the same order of the presentation. Hope it's not too confusing. But I have another point about your view on your discussion with Eslund and epistocracy.
Yeah, could I ask you to pause for a moment? I need to step away from, but you can continue posing the question. I have my earphones on, so I'm going to walk off camera, but please continue. I'll be back in a moment.
Should I keep talking then?
Okay. Yeah, please, because I can walk around.
Okay. Okay. So so I will keep asking the question. So my second point was on epistocracy and the debate that you are presenting, you are posing with Eslund. So I'm not sure I understood the debate there. So this is how I understood Eslund's criticism to like what might be called political egalitarianism. He's concerned about the quality of democracy. And he's concerned with democracy. So democracy, as you said in your talk, democracy has this property of being a good mechanism for solving collective problems, for we together solving collective problems. Democracy is good at producing policy. Somehow it is able to trace good policies. And it seems that Eslund is saying, well, if we are too concerned about political equality, then maybe we lose that property of democracy. We lose this property of democracy being good at tracing good policy. And I think in the paper, somehow you mentioned, I think you didn't mention that in the talk, but in the paper, somehow you mentioned to some of the examples that he gives. And one of them, it seems quite intuitive, actually, right? So he says, well, if we somehow, I think it goes like this, if we, in deliberation, we want to be egalitarians, and we allocate like 1 minute each person to talk, so we include everybody, well, we are actually not having a meaningful deliberation, right? So like every single person says what they have to say, but 1 minute is not enough for a deliberation. And then you are basically losing this important element of deliberative democracy that is conducive of good policy. Something similar with campaign financing, right? Like if we allow a very little amount of money for supporting electoral campaigns, maybe the party doesn't get enough money to make a kind of meaningful campaign, you know, like you are actually ruining a vital element of democracy. So the epistemic element of democracy or valuable elements of democracy seem to be jeopardized if we are too insistent in political equality. So this is how I sort of somehow understand Eslund's view. So I have sort of a comment, it's partly kind of a criticism to Eslund's objection, but in responding to Eslund, I think I might be also skeptical of your point on Eslund, because it might be, I mean, I just wonder why not conceiving political equality in sort of a sufficientarian way, you know, like equalizing up to a point in which each of us gets sufficient political influence as to be able to make meaningful political contributions. And I emphasize on the meaningful, right? So it's not like Harry Frankfurt's minimalistic sufficientarianism, but it could be something like, so we reach this threshold in which all of us, or, you know, like there is meaningful political power for each of us. And then if we reach that, or if we somehow manage to identify this, then Eslund's view starts to make sense again, right? Like, why would we insist on keeping equality in this minimal, in the sufficient threshold, if tolerating a certain amount of inequality maybe in access to time in deliberation, or this kind of sort of inequalities, if we tolerate that, maybe we improve the quality of the decision making in democracy. So I would like to know what your reaction is to this kind of view. Like maybe up above a sufficientarian point, and again, meaningful power to make meaningful contributions to politics. Maybe there we might be able to tolerate inequalities in politics. It might be. So I'm just curious to know how would you react to this kind of thought. And then with regards to your discussion, or like your debate with Dworkin, I am a bit curious to know how the way I interpret the point you're making, and I'm curious to know if how you feel about being identified as someone who defends the view I interpret you were defending here. So you say, well, Dworkin's view is something like a lifestyle of political activism is an expensive taste. It's similar to a lifestyle of drinking expensive wine and traveling all around the world. So this seems to be Dworkin's view. And then you can't complain because you have less political influence. If society is just, you can't complain because, well, you just decided to have that kind of life. And I'm wondering if in your reply, in the way you react to Dworkin's view, I wonder if the way you state your view leads you to have kind of an opposing view as Dworkin's. It seems to me that what follows from your view is that someone who decides not to have a engaged political life, that is the person who is actually taking a expensive lifestyle, right? So I decided not to take up my opportunity to participate in politics. And now, since I didn't participate in politics, I didn't build up a politically engaged life. Now I cannot complain to have less political influence as my classmate from college, who is actually elected in the representative house. So he has more power than me, but he's been for the last 15 years building up his career. So people who actually work up their careers in politics, they do have more political power. But it seems that what you're saying is something like, well, they are actually taking they're taking the opportunities that society is giving them, let's say in a just society, right? And those of us who are not, we can't complain because we just decided to have a life of indifference towards politics, or we didn't give enough attention to politics. So our inequalities right now, again, in a just society, are just a matter of responsibility of our past choices in life. So I don't know so it seems that then the standard view, so what we might expect in a just society as you conceive it, is that people actually are engaged in politics. And those who do not engage is because they are deciding to have this expensive life, that they can't afford to be indifferent to politics, and maybe not having an impact in how politics shapes their options in life and what kind of lifestyles they want to follow. So I would be curious to know. And then related to that, I was a bit puzzled by, well, also related, I think it's more related to Eslund's view on political equality, but also has to do with Dworkin's. This view of being equally motivated to participate in politics, plus what you called, I think, following Rawls, probably political competence. So, like, equally competent people and equally motivated people should have roughly the same opportunities to get into politics. And I got the feeling that at a certain point you concede the point, like the criticism, say, well, yeah, we can't actually aim for real political equality because some elements will have an influence, right? Like you were saying, like taller people get more attention and it's easier for them to make it into life, basically. Maybe good-looking people as well, and charismatic, more articulated people, they have more, it is easier for those kind of people to make a political career. And that seems to be something, it seems, I got the feeling that you are saying, well, these kind of things, we can't control for that, we can't avoid that. And that's kind of probably a tragedy we have to live with. You know, like we can't have full-fledged political equality because these kind of things are going to have an influence in how people vote and how people choose their representatives. And I was just curious to know, so there are some experiments of recently, I think Ireland, for instance, the issue on abortion, it was decided upon deliberation from randomly selected group of people. So they go to the population, select a random sample, they make them deliberate, and then I don't know if in Ireland, it was like that, but you might give them decision-making power. So there are some experiments. I know in Chile, with the constitutional process, they are doing some experiments with randomly selecting people to deliberate about how to shape the new constitution. In France, they have something similar with climate policy. So in Finland, they did something. It ultimately failed, but the constitution of the country, they tried to make it with, you know, like randomly selected people from the population, and it might work, and it controls for these things that you were suggesting are non-possible to control. So I'm curious to know if you have thoughts about, if you have a kind of a principled objection to these kind of experiments that might bring like a kind of more realized, more transparently this idea of political equality. I see that many people have questions, so I will just make one more question, and then, you know, so we have more time for the questions of the people from the audience. And this is perhaps, I don't know if this is allowed in this kind of environments, because I have a question actually of something that you didn't say in the presentation, which is not in the paper, but which is about something that you, actually have done important work, and is in the conception of socialism, and in the definition of socialism that so you somehow define socialism quite coherent with the tradition of socialism as a society in which the means of production are the property of the means of production is public, not private. And so that's kind of I guess non-controversial claim if you're trying to define socialism. But what I found, I was looking at the book that Lucas mentioned at the beginning, the Socialism for Soloists. And in that passage in which you are defining the means of production, and I'm making this question just as an invitation for you to talk a little bit more about that? And also for people in the audience who might have not read the book, maybe go and read the book because it's actually very interesting. And this is kind of a teaser of the kind of reflections that we find in that book. So you say, well, the means of production need to be publicly owned, not privately. And then there is a list that you offer of examples of the means of production. And you say, well, the means of production are, for example, currency, the highway system, the postal service, the broadcast spectrum, telecommunications, power generation and distribution, investment banking, insurance, airways, railways, hospitals, agribusiness, many extractive industries, petrochemicals, internet service providers. And so far, they are all kind of generic terms. But then the list continues, and you actually name by the name some firms: Facebook, Amazon, Google. So these are the means of production. And in a socialist regime, these will be owned by the public. So I would like you to say something, what all these things have in common. So they are the means of production. What do they have in common? And what they don't have in common with something that in the next page you say doesn't belong to the means of production, and which I think many people would think, well, like if Facebook, Google, and Amazon are part of the means of production, also the Coca-Cola company would be part of the means of production. But you say, well, no, Coca-Cola is not part of the means of production. So I guess in a socialist regime, Coca-Cola would be privately owned while Facebook wouldn't. So, I mean, the answer to this question is very clearly stated in the book, but I would like you, like as a way of advertising the book here, maybe if you give us kind of a, why Coca-Cola company wouldn't be part of the means of production, and why, and what's that Amazon and the hospitals and the highway system, what do they have in common, so we can classify them as being part of the means of production. So I think I will stop here, and thank you very much for your paper again.
Thank
you, Sebastian, for the very thoughtful questions. I don't want to give short shrift to any of them, but I also want to try to address all of them to your satisfaction. What if we had a society in which political equality was realized, but it turned out that most of the political influence was possessed by, exercised by, say, men, and that in that society, women stayed away from politics. Now, this condition was enforced coercively in most of the world for much of human history. What if it persisted despite, say, our success in keeping money out of politics and social connection from influencing, from determining the degree of political influence one had? It would be consistent with justice only if we could say that women and men possess political competence in something like that proportion. That say, for example, that even though equally adept at argumentation and equally knowledgeable about current affairs, women were just less interested in public service than men. That would be a very, very disturbing circumstance. And abstractly, yes, it could happen. What we say then? I think we would have to look more carefully at our suppositions of the satisfaction of the premise of of fair political equality. Notice also that we must have fair equality of opportunity. It's possible that gender roles simply happen to attract people that have lesser interest in politics. That could happen. It hasn't. In countries in which there's women can vote and hold office, they do vote and they do hold office. So I don't know what to say to that. But the other side of that is how many people in the lowest quintile or decile of the income distribution hold political office? In the United States, that would be around zero. They're simply not represented. So there's an interesting debate going on in the US right now about the relative importance of race and class. There are those who say that you've got to recognize race as a separate, completely separate, autonomous source and arena of oppression. And there are those who say, no, class is really the great dividing line in society, and racial divisions are imposed by the wealthy in order to keep the less wealthy, the working class, divided. And so I don't. My sense is that a great deal of the racial disparity in the distribution of wealth and income is at the upper end of the distribution. Now, the racial wealth gap is largely accounted for by the difference between the wealth of the top decile of white people compared to the top decile of Black people. When you get at the bottom decile, the bottom 10%, you're talking about people that are, the gap is much smaller there. And that has practical political consequences because you can't, it's hard to unite the bottom decile if one half of the bottom decile thinks that it's down there because of its race and the other thinks that it's not. So, my suggestion is to take a look at some of the work by Matt Bruenig of the People's Policy Institute, Adolph Reed is someone else who's been involved in this debate. It's not been resolved, but it's a very difficult thing on race. And as to gender, one of my colleagues, Mary Radford, who's an expert in the legal field of trusts of estates, candidly told me that because of the difference in longevity between men and women, that actually women, total wealth held by women is greater than the total wealth held by men, because the men die. Their legatees are female. So the problems are complex. And I think in some of the Scandinavian countries, a majority of seats in the legislature are held by women. And that's in many significant posts of government as well. The United States, maybe an outlier, Brazil, you're ahead of us in that respect. Youssef was prime minister, is that right? President, help me here. You could say that Rawls's approach is class reductionist in the sense that it's behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know whether you're black, you're white, you're rich, poor, male, female, non-binary. You don't know any of that stuff, and you're choosing principles that you could live with no matter what you turned out to be. So it's going to be difficult, of course, to confront the non-ideal when you find disparities. But those you have to sort of do some more work and decide how to address them. It seems to me to be quite clear that Rawls believed that political inequality was the fundamental injustice in American, U.S. society. And I suspect that same critique would apply to Brazil, Colombia, France, even Norway. Second question, what about a sufficientarian view rather than an egalitarian view of political influence? Kevin Valier has suggested that alternative to me, that we just say, well, let's agree on a certain level that's sufficient. And once everyone meets that sufficiency threshold, we should be content and not try to further pursue political equality. I find that suggestion to run out of plausibility very quickly. How much is enough? Not enough so that I win. No, that can't be. That we can't set it that high. I just sufficient to what? I mean, if it's not sufficient to satisfy the person, that can't be it, because that would deprive the disappointed and the disenchanted and the disillusioned of any claim of justice to have political influence. That's a wrong result. Do we define it in terms of some comprehensive conception of just society? Well, that's Dworkin's idea, and I think it's also shared by Esalen, although Esalen has less to say about what a just society looks like, or an egalitarian society looks like. In Dworkin's view, we could all be wrong about what equality requires, but the right democracy is whatever produces the right kind of equality, just whatever it is. And if we disagree about what that right kind of equality is, we're certainly going to get nowhere trying to figure out whether we have sufficient political influence in toward achieving it. I think the idea that maybe caps are limits are to be approached carefully has some merit. Certainly, we don't want to reproduce the phenomenon of of what we call gerrymandering here in the United States, where the party in power manipulates the allowable political spending level in a way to perpetuate its rule. Obviously, that's a fear. That's a real worry. But that could also be abused on the subsidy end as well, where a party in power decides to subsidize itself and no other party. I mean, these are obviously unjust measures that would not be tolerable in a just society. Let me see, I've got a note here and I can't read it. Political slackers. Yeah, well, I think Rawls, Dworkin caricatures Rawls's view without naming Rawls. It's the only person he can be talking about in his 1987 article. Says, oh, well, you know, if you're for political equality, that must mean that you want slackers to have as much political power as the people that devote their lives to causes. That's not what Rawls says. Rawls defines fair value political equality as equal influence, adjusting for, setting as fixed a given level of aptitude and motivation. So no slacker should expect to have any political influence, nor do they deserve it. Dworkin is kind of modulating between the responsibility thing and the dimension that Rawls was defining. People that are equally apt at politics and have given equal effort ought to have roughly equal influence, regardless of extraneous things like social connection and wealth. That seems, why would you agree to anything else behind the veil of ignorance? I mean, you're agreeing to economic inequalities that benefit everybody. But political influence divided unequally doesn't work that way. Economic inequalities, up to a certain point, can be expected to create a bigger pie. This is the trickle-down, rising tide raises all boats metaphor that was sort of the motif of the neoliberal era, which may be ending. Politics is different. And when Rawls was ahead of the pack in a number of ways. One of them was his attention to the effects of the succession of generations. Mill sort of had an eye on this too, but even if you think that there's some correlation between an entrepreneur's success and business and an entrepreneur's ability to run a government, and that's a will-o'-the-wisp of American political dialogue that persists no matter what. What about the second generation? What about your third generation? There's simply no empirical ground for thinking that ability to get rich is correlated with ability to govern. As a matter of fact, our most prominent examples are to the contrary. Fourth question. You make a good point about variations on the idea of sortition or government by lottery. yes, you want to have discussion, but do you want the discussion just to be among experts? Should we put everybody out of the discussion who isn't an expert? That I gather is Jason Brennan's have thought. Well, who gets to pick the experts? Who decides who's an expert? We have some. Anyways, need I say more? But the idea of having citizen assemblies, I mean, that's been run with some success, where you have something like political equality in a robust Rawlsian sense, and discussion. And Estlund makes his point about epistemic value with respect to examples of just pure lottery. Well, obviously, that looks like a crazy thing. And who sets the agenda? I mean, that is a prior question. Do we want the agenda set by lottery? We put all possible political questions into a basket. Next, socialism, means of production. Okay, why Facebook and not Coca-Cola? I define, and that's just my sort of trying to figure out what this was all about, the means of production to be things that are essential to living a productive life that can't be severally owned. By severally owned, I mean that not everybody can have one of that's exclusively his or hers. The trademark, the only thing of value in Coca-Cola is the trade name, the ability to exclude others from using, to charge people for drinking sugar water. I'm speaking from Atlanta, so I can, I can beat up on the hometown gorilla a little bit. Also, the world's leading producer of plastic waste. That's not to say they shouldn't be regulated, maybe even put out of business. They were, the original product contained cocaine from your Colombia. Thank you. And then it had to be removed as an impurity. I don't know what happened with removed cocaine. Anyway, long story short, now it's free of alcohol, free of cocaine, as far as we know, and still it ruins people's health. It still rots their teeth out and gives them, huge accumulations of fat around their middles. I digress. That's why Coca-Cola is not a means of production, because it's not essential to living a productive life. As a matter of fact, it's important to avoid it if you want to live a productive life. Some people might find a stimulative beverage of some kind to be important, but now Amazon, let me pick Amazon because that's my favorite example, because the idea of Amazon was, I first heard the idea of Amazon from the father of a friend of mine growing up in Mountain Brook, Alabama, a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama, when I was maybe 25, and this was some time ago. And he was just this he was a lawyer, a prosperous lawyer, and he'd just sit in his armchair as a wing chair and opine, just dispense wisdom for his son's friends who would listen. And of course, you had to listen to him because you were in his house. And he said, oh, I had this idea for a camera store that would have no inventory. Nope. Part of your overhead, main part of your overhead in the camera business is you have inventory. You got to have all those cameras there. And that inventory can be stolen. It can, not be, the thing to do is you just have samples on the floor and you have a computer. The computer connects you with the manufacturer. and you have practically no inventory. People come in, they look at the camera, they pick out a camera. On the computer, you enter an order and it comes right to you. Eliminate the middleman, middle person. And I mean, you're just one step away from Amazon. Just that Bezos' first product was books rather than cameras. You don't have any inventory. You don't have any bookstores. I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea. It's got to grow. It's got to succeed. It cannot fail. And the more unified it is, the more it is a network, the more utility it has. I mean, Amazon knows what I need before I know what I need. It's part of the means of production because it's essential to living a productive life now. And don't say, well, I have an aunt who doesn't even have a computer. Well, I mean, then there's no means of production because there's always going to be some hermit somewhere that just lives on a broth made of boiled roots. So there are no means of production. Yeah, there are. There's certain things that we all need, and that we can't all have our own one of. We can all have a cell phone. We ought all to have a cell phone, but we can't all have an Amazon. That's the distinction I'm trying to make. In the 19th century, it was the railways. It was impossible for everyone to own a railway. Everyone could own a mule and 40 acres, but it was impossible for everyone to have a railway because the railway's utility presumes that it's connected. And you can't have people with, no, you're on my section of railway now. You have to, find another way around. Now, Nozick's fantasy land of private ownership. Yeah, you could find yourself surrounded. Your enemies may have bought up all the adjacent property and you have to helicopter out. That's crazy stuff. I have to excuse myself. And Lucas, you'll pick out the next question for me. Does that answer your questions, Sebastian? I'll be happy to go on, but I have to take a short break.
Okay. What do you think, Sebastian? Do you have any follow-ups or comments?
No, I think it's. I mean, I have a lot of things to say.
Right.
Very nice, but I see that there are many questions as well. So I think it's better just to go to the audience with questions. Thank you very much for the answers.
Let's make a first round of questions. We have a couple of them. If Professor Edmondson agrees, we can start with, we can start with Nunzio Ali, and he can make the question himself. And then I have another one from the internet, and maybe we can make two rounds of questions, 2 rounds of 2 questions, so it won't be overwhelming for our guests. Nunzio, are you here?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Just let us wait. Oh. Hi, William. Is it okay if we just start out 2 rounds of questions of 2? So it's
sure. I'm at your
manageable
disposal. Yeah,
Great.
I've got nothing planned for the evening, so let's go.
Good, thank you. So we have one. The first one is from Nunzio. He's here with us, so he can speak for himself. So please go ahead, Nunzio.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Thank you very much, Professor, for the talk, for all your research in these years. Very grateful. And I have two questions. The first is about your talk, and is something that now I am curious for your answer to Sebastian. You talk about that Rawls want to equality of influence of political equality of political influence. Is equality of fairness of political influence? Because it's difficult. Because if you admit, and I admit also that wealth inequality can translate in the political equality. Equality of political influence means perfect material inequality. So, because I think that as to I am very agree with your critic about the general vision about the Estud about justice, but epistemic justice. But I think that the point of Estud is could be less ambition because he wants to avoid with his formalist, moderate formalist, two things. Avoid the perfect material inequality and great inequality. So I think that is possible, in order to maintain fair political liberty, equality of political liberty, doesn't mean to pursue material equality. So, but I think if I am correct, he agree with this, that is not impossible, should be impossible to have a lot wealth. So this is just the first question. And I think that Rawls can answer better than Estud because Rawls agree that should not pursue the perfect material equality, but just guarantee the fair of equality of political liberty. The second question is about, like with Sebastian, I would like to take advantage of your presence, and my question concerns the fact that once we have understood the fair value of equality liberties really matters, what social contract should require to ensure it? I am not sure if according to you, the means of production are the main and strict necessary instrument to reduce economic inequality and wealth concentration, or instead there are a specific currency of justice, a sort of social primary good apart from income and wealth. So this is my doubt, my question, because I think that from this point there are two different interpretations might be possible. You said that the question of means of production should discuss including the social contract. Okay. According to the first interpretation, all means of production should be under control, and it is sufficient to ensure the fair value of equality liberties, because in this way, as a result, we maintain economic inequality enough low. The second interpretation is that the public means of production are necessary, but not sufficient. And you need to provide also insularities and accumulation policies. If the correct interpretation, the first one, I have some doubt that just to make public means of production you can reduce automatically economic inequality, because it depends also on the kind of economic reward and accumulation of inheritance a society permit or not. So I am not sure that if the public means of production, with the public means of production, you can guarantee the reduction of economic inequality itself. The second interpretation, if the correct interpretation, the second one, I would like that you explain better why we have to believe that if wealth inequality is low, so anti-accumulation policy device works, it is still a problem for private means of production, have private means of production. Given that, I suppose that in this scenario, nobody can control them in a great portion. You just have a small portion of a mean of production. Of course, for me, it's not clear how they control so significantly the public agenda. I assume and conclude two things from this interpretation that it is possible a joint stock company and the management and the ownership of mean of production are two different things. And also, in this case, also for you, I think that the question of management remain a fundamental problem question, even if the mean and production are public. So the point is, if you have just a small portion, what is the problem? Just this, how you can control, for example, the management, because your vote depends on this small part, or how you can influence the public debate because you don't have a lot of weight to buy public office or spend in a political foundation and other means. So this is the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nunzio. May I collect
thanks.
another one, William, or you?
Okay. Well, if I've got my notes are kind of schematic here on
Right.
those questions.
Sure.
If you had a third question to the ones he's just asked, I might have my notes might not mean anything to
So
me.
please go ahead. Then we can pass to the other three.
If I think I understand your first question to go to Rawls's position on political equality. I'm taking a chance by using just the political equality as a phrase that's shorthand for fair, valued, equal political liberty. It's not strict equality because Rawls doesn't think there should be strict political equality in the sense that would allow someone who didn't try or was a complete moron to have the same political influence as people who made an effort and had some sense. Okay, it's fair in the sense that at equal levels of effort and aptitude, you have equal influence. It's like fair equality of opportunity, only it has to do specifically with political influence. And notice that fair valued political equality is in the first principle. Fair equality of opportunity generally is in the second principle, which means that we cannot sacrifice fair political equality even to achieve greater fair equality of opportunity. Second, does that answer? Yeah. Second question. Two interpretations. I think I'm with mine is the second. Let me put it this way. Matt Bruni does a wonderful way of explaining how welfare state is different from socialism. And that's why Rawls can speak coherently of a welfare state capitalism. A welfare state capitalist society is one in which the means of production are privately owned and there's a generous social safety net. And that can include paid parental leave, it can include free healthcare at point of service, free education as far as you want to go. It can be very generous or it can be very stingy. Okay, that's sort of up to the political process to determine where that social safety net is kept. A socialist society is one in which the means of production are publicly owned. That doesn't mean that there's any welfare state at all. It doesn't guarantee that there's any welfare state. A socialist society might be an undemocratic state. It might be a state that works all its citizens to the bone. It's for the everything's publicly owned, jointly owned, but it's not necessarily democratic. So what Rawls outlines is a liberal democratic socialism. And that is what he says is one of the two ideal regime types that is capable of realizing justice as fairness. We won't know which we should elect until the veil of ignorance is lifted sufficiently to tell us where in space and time we find ourselves. In other words, where in history are we? And my hypothesis is that as of the late 18th century, when societies were still largely agrarian, before industrialization had taken off, it was an intelligible and even perhaps a practical goal that everyone who wanted to could have his or her self-sufficient farm, freehold. And that was the selling point of Lincoln's Republican Party. That's what he envisaged as a perfectly just society. Now, if the veil is lifted and you find yourself in America in 1820, the concept of the means of production doesn't yet have any clear application except to say the waterways of the United States, the post office. These were publicly owned. They were owned by the federal sovereign. If you were plopped down in 1850, when you see the advent of fossil fuel, the exploitation of fossil fuels, the creation of transportation and communication networks, it ought to be foreseeable that these networks will have a utility that makes them unsuitable for individual several ownership. They must be owned publicly, lest in private hands, they completely decenter the balance of political forces. And I think Lincoln saw this too late once he'd been elected president, and the vulture squid from Wall Street was arranging the war that was to come. And the Pacific Railroad Act essentially gave a national transcontinental network to private interests. Everybody can own 40 acres and a mule. Not everybody can own a railroad. The railroad companies ran American politics for the rest of that century. And there was just one set of private owners after another. As rail gave way to the automobile and the highway and so forth. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you can have a welfare state wholly apart from a selection of a mode of ownership of the means of production. As a matter of fact, the means of production may not have arrived in history yet. But once you know that you are in a place in history where they exist, then justice demands that those means of production, those things that are vital to anyone's having a productive life, and which cannot ever be severally owned, must be publicly owned. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Yes, clear.
Great. We collected a couple of very interesting questions here. Maybe because of the time, I may state all of them together, the three of them together actually, and you can handle them as you want, because we have more or less 30 minutes, and then you can just finish your talk in your own way, as you may wish.
30 more minutes, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So the first one is from Felipe Moraes. Thank you for the question, Felipe. He would like to hear you more about your new book. And I quote him here. Why did you choose the expression soloists instead of individualists, for example? Where did you get this idea of moral person as a soloist? And another related point, isn't the requirement to control the means of production too much specific for a soloist? Wouldn't he choose first the distribution of wealth in general? This is the first one. Then Daniel Nascimento, our colleague from Rio, thank you, Daniel, has the following question. The upshot of your discussion of Tocqueville in the paper seems to be that defining democracy as a system in which all citizens have a certain set of rights is not enough. This is because it leaves open the possibility that a system will count as democratic, even if it includes oppressive institutions, such as slavery, for example. The way I see it, this will remain true even if we postulate that democracy grants not only rights, but also the fair value of this right, as long as the system doesn't count the oppressed slaves as citizens. Have you got any thoughts on how we should modify this definition in order to match our intuitions that democracy is both promoting equality and outlawing certain forms of oppression? And finally, Ulisses Ferraz has the following question in two parts. Professor Edmundson, do you need some time, Professor? Is everything
No,
all right?
I am just grabbing some paper here.
Okay.
Just questions.
Please take your time. Grab the paper. I can wait.
So first is why soloists?
Why soloists? And isn't it too specific? Let me read it again. Isn't the requirement to control the means of production too specific for soloists? Wouldn't they choose first the distribution of wealth in general? And the second one was about Tocqueville.
Okay, and the second one was about Tocqueville. And equality. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
And now we have the final one, the last one. Ulysses asks, I quote here again, Professor Edmundson, according to the first principle of justice, fair value is restricted to political liberties. He's quoting from political liberalism. But in other passages of his texts, Rawls seems to hold that the fair value of other political liberties is guaranteed indirectly by the difference principle. For example, he quotes, in a well-ordered society in which both the equal basic liberties with their fair values and fair equality of opportunity are secured, the distribution of income and wealth illustrates what we may call pure background procedural justice. It's from Justice as Fairness. So we could say that what he actually rejects is to take specific measures beyond those related to the difference principle to ensure fair value in the case of other basic liberties in Rawls's theory. Or in your view, are these other basic liberties only formally guaranteed? Thank you. And he actually has a second follow-up question.
Okay.
You argue in your book, John Rawls, Reticent Socialist, that the choice of socio-economic regimes must be carried out at the constitutional stage. But if this is the case, unlike Rawls's position, should the right to private ownership of the means of production be considered a basic right to be included among the essential constitution's elements? Thank you. These are all three.
Okay. So now it's over to me. Why did I call it socialism for soloists instead of socialism for individualists? I like the alliteration, I guess, tempted by that. Individualists, soloists. There's no shading the meaning up there. My editor liked it. If this editor said no, it must be socialism for individualists, I probably would have said, okay, all right, you win. You got me. But he didn't, so there we are. Now, soloist, would a soloist insist on public ownership of the means of production in advance of selecting some more general principle of distribution? And I think the answer is no. No, the choice of a social system occurs in the second stage of what Rawls calls the four-stage sequence. First stage is the original position, where the veil is, all the way down. Can't tell where you are, who you are. You just know that you want to maximize your primary goods. You don't even know what you want them for. You know certain very general facts about human nature, but you don't know whether you're living in Paleolithic circumstances, whether you're in a hunter-gatherer or maybe in an artist collective, or, who knows where you are? You don't know. At the constitutional stage, the veil is lifted enough to tell you who else is in your territory, your polity, what people is this term. It's only at the second stage that the choice of public or private ownership of the means of production is posed. Rawls has the choice of the principle of distribution made in the original position, and you're right. It's the original position. We don't even know that there are such things as means of production, much less whether we would insist on having a right to own them. So, in the original position, Rawls has us delay the choice of the principle for the distribution of wealth and income to the second principle, after we have chosen a principle of distribution of the equal basic liberties. And the principle of distribution is equality. But it's a formal equality, except for the political liberties, the specifically political liberties. There we would insist, he argues, on a principle of fair valued equality rather than merely formal equality. So also with the first component of the second principle, we would insist on fair equality of opportunity rather than careers open to talents, he calls it. People shouldn't have an advantage that's conveyed to them by the circumstances of their birth and family position. For whatever career opportunities, job, work opportunities are in society, people having equal talent, equal drive, ought to have an equal shot. Consistent with, provided that the equal basic liberties are secure, they have a prior position. So it would be unjust, for example, to try to promote fair equality of opportunity by forbidding professional associations. A legislature might reasonably conclude that professional associations just turn into guilds where you wind up, back scratching, and suddenly, relatives come to dominate a profession or a craft. We've got to break up these associations. You can't do that on Rawls's principles. But what has to be guaranteed is fair political equality. Okay. And he says political equality is part of a family of equal basic liberties that have to be adjusted and balanced. So if fair political equality is threatened by certain associations, then it's a question of balancing. Neither has priority. It's a question of judgment. Now that may be, say, well, see, you just run out of, now you're balancing again. One of the guiding ambitions of Rawls's theory is to, let's not say we'll just balance. We've got, where we can, we must put things in a kind of order, a defensible order to guide our judgments, so that we know which things are to be traded off against each other and which things are not to be traded off for any amount of gain in some other dimension. So we cannot allow the imposition of a religious creed by the use of state power. Even if we judged that, gosh, if we were all Calvinists, we'd be a much wealthier society. And maybe that's true, but it's unjust. That would not be something that would be freely consented to by choosers in the original position. So let me get back to my sheet here. So you're right, there are certain questions that are too specific to be put in the original position. But in the constitutional stage, we learn where we are, when we are. We know that we're burning coal. We may regret it later. We are regretting it later, but now enormous networks of communication, transportation become possible that can't be distributed individually to each person. They have to be networked together. And now we find that there's things like Amazon, Facebook, which are their entire utility consists, and they're forming these seamless networks. And the question is, who shall own it? Mark Zuckerberg? Well, he thought of it, didn't he? No. He didn't think of it. He was hired by a couple of these twins, these Winklevoss guys. They're now into cryptocurrencies, but they said, we had a great idea. Let's have a we'll call it the Facebook, the Harvard the Facebook. This is our idea. Everybody can go on. All the guys can go online, see pictures of the girls. Sick. We crawl out of the mire. And then it became obvious, to whom would it not be obvious, that, hey, this is a great idea. You can get people to compulsively come here and check out what people have said about their returns. I mean, this is going to happen. The question is, who's going to own it? Mark Zuckerberg owns it now. Let's see if we can hang on to it. My note says, oh, de Tocqueville. Oh yeah, de Tocqueville. Well, all kinds of regimes have claimed to be democratic that aren't. I mean, the United States, we believe up here, what was a democracy? It was founded as a democracy. Well, wait a second, how could it be a democracy? It had slaves, women had no rights, they were property of their husbands. Well, it's democracy for those that are the ends, and it's a dictatorship to everybody else. Okay, so de Tocqueville was right that if you just, ignored the Native Americans, the African Americans, the women, the indentured, and so forth, it's a democracy among those people. But as to those the outs, it's not. Okay, so the point I was trying to make about de Tocqueville is that he seemed to think that well, there are fewer social distinctions made in the U.S. There are fewer officials that have any sort of say over people. It's really democratic. Well, you can say that a democracy just consists in the achievement of some kind of equality by whatever means. Or you could say it's a specific political arrangement. Okay, de Tocqueville agreed with essentially with Dworkin. If you bring about the right kind of equality, doesn't matter how you get there, but you do need to attend to how people feel about it, about how they got there. So Dworkin talks about distributional consequences and participatory consequences. Where participatory consequences are this sort of, I'm not sure I quite understand it, but it has something to do with making people feel included. But of course, you can make people feel included when in fact they're powerless. And you might say, well, if you're getting the kind of equality you deserve according to the correct principles, then it doesn't matter that you're deceived. Undeceive yourself and just be thankful that you live in a society that's being managed for you. Well, that's completely alien to Rawls's conception. And one of the most lamentable things about political philosophy is that so many people have managed to think of Rawls and Dworkin as peas in a pod. The complete misunderstanding of the profound difference in point of view between the two. It had something to do with personalities. Rawls was a very withdrawn, quiet person who just had powerful ideas. Dworkin was a very powerful, outgoing person with some rather nebulous and quite bad ideas, who just happened to have a greater influence, in my humble opinion. Wrong sticker here. Lucas has a fair value of other equal basic liberties indirectly guaranteed by the difference principle. Yeah, I think that the difference principle, if it's satisfied, is going to at least, if it's satisfied, it assures that that in absolute terms, the amount of resources that people have to enjoy their equal basic liberties couldn't be any better without it's risking being worse. So in that indirect sense, but it still may fall very far short. There may be huge differences in the relative worth of the basic liberties to people in different income brackets, wealth brackets. That's not corrected for. Now, Rawls confesses this. He says that's why we get to the difference principle as late as we do in the lexical ordering. The fair value of political liberties has to be guaranteed first. Fair equality of opportunity, the other equal basic liberties. This is the background justice he's talking about. If background justice is fixed, then, and the difference principle is also satisfied, then the distribution of wealth and income is just, whatever it happens to be. It's a matter of pure or quasi-pure procedural justice. That is the sense in which some worth of all the equal basic liberties, even the non-political ones, is promoted by the satisfaction of the difference principle. Now, in Justice's Fairness restatement, there's a rather subtle new argument. He calls the second fundamental comparison, in which he answers the following challenge. Suppose the first principle is installed and there's fair equality of opportunity, and there's a social minimum that's some sufficientarian threshold is satisfied. And Rawls concedes in an exchange with Rodney Peffer that's sort of assumed that you're at a certain material level such that basic needs can be assured. If all that is there, who cares whether the difference principle or a restricted principle of utility governs the distribution of wealth and income? And Rawls's argument is interesting, somewhat subtle, might not persuade everybody. He admits this isn't going to blow you away, but it's enough to incline the reason. And that is that if what saves people from desperate bad results is regarded as a matter of charity, they are in a subordinate, inferior position with respect to everyone else. The difference principle is a way of expressing to each that he or she is regarded as a co-venturer. We bear these risks equally. And if you need to take some time off, we support you during that time off, not because we feel sorry for you, because you're a loser. It's because that's the deal. That's what we sign up for. That's part of the social contract. The restricted principle of utility doesn't doesn't convey that sense of reciprocity. We're all in this together. Restricted utility, like principle of utility itself says, if you're a loser, that doesn't matter. What matters is the aggregate. And that's takes us back to Rawls's initial complaint against utilitarianism. It doesn't really take us seriously as having individual worth. And the last thing, Nuncio, was about the constitutional stage. Could you remind me what was it? That was from.
It's here in the chat.
It wasn't Nuncio. It's in the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I can read
I
you.
put in the chat.
It's here. You argue in your book, John Rawls, Reticent Socialist, that the choice of socio-economic regimes must be carried out at the constitutional stage. But if this is the case, unlike Rawls's own position, should the right to private ownership of the means of production be considered a basic right to be included among the essential constitutional elements? Thank you.
Okay. Did I answer this already?
Yeah, kind of, I think.
The question about private versus public ownership of the means of production isn't posed in the original position, right? Because in the original position, we only know certain basic general facts about human beings. And that is intended by Rawls, I assume, to take us to span all of recorded, at least all of recorded human history, maybe some of the reconstructed human history. So there's the means of production in the relevant sense here didn't really haven't always existed. Right? And a hunter-gatherer existence doesn't involve means of production. I mean, you have little tools, and everybody can have a little hand axe, a knife. Maybe they're not enough to go around. Well, then you make more. You can do that. You can't make more Amazons. You can give everybody a share of Amazon, but having a share of Amazon is not like owning a divisible piece of Amazon from which you can exclude everybody else. Like owning a share of a railroad doesn't give you a right to say, well, I'll take this section here. No, pal, you don't understand. You own a right to the earnings, to the proceeds of the dissolution of the railroad corporation. You don't have a section of track with your initials on it. Like, very simple confusion. That's why we have law schools. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. We are actually on time, but just on time. So everything went quite well. I believe we have a lot of more questions to do, but could you send me a transcript of the chat, because I'm curious to have a chance to respond to them, to those questions that we didn't get to during the session. I definitely can do it, and I send it to you directly.
That's great. Yeah,
I would like to thank you, Professor, for your time, your acceptance of this invitation, and I believe I speak for everyone here that it was a pleasure to share the evening with you. I'm looking forward your talk at the University of Rio de Janeiro on January. We posted the link with the official calendar of events from the University of Rio in your YouTube channel. So please join us for a next round of questions and debates. There are a lot of very interesting people that, among others, William de Monte, of course, but Sam Freeman will be there, Martin O'Neill. So please try to follow up in the chat. Yes, and thank you very much. I don't know if Sebastian would like to to say something else, or Nunzio or Raisa, please feel free.
I just want to thank you, Professor, for your generosity,
Thank you, Sebastian.
answering our questions and being here with us. I learned a
Pleasure
lot
for me.
with, discussing with you, reading your paper. It was really a very nice experience for us
Thank
here. Thank you very much.
You're kind. Well, thank you all for your attention and stimulation. Challenge.
Great.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for the sake of the event as a whole, I would like to thank everybody who has been following us this week, along the week, and remind you that all the talks are recorded and we put on our web page, imaginações.políticas.com.br. The idea is to build up a repository of talks annually, if possible, or biannually. We don't know yet, but the idea is to keep it going, because building up imaginations are much more, it's harder than it looks like. People think it's easier, but actually it's harder to conceive different courses of action. And I'm sure that the talk today was very inspiring on this aspect. So thank you again, and see you in a different occasion. I hope personally, but if it's not possible, through Zoom or chat or whatever. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.